Welcome to Dear Book Coach. I'm Terry Thayer, author, book coach, certified focusing professional, and I live in Longmont, Colorado, outside of Boulder.
I'm Carrie Savage, a writer and certified book coach, and I live in Somerville, Massachusetts, just outside Boston.
And I am Stephanie Detlefs, writer and certified book coach, living in Bellingham, Washington, which is about an hour and a half north of Seattle.
This is a friendly advice space as you plan, draft, and revise your novel. In each video, we answer one question submitted by a writer like you with 3 different points of view, and you get to pick the advice that resonates for you. Today's question comes from Lisa. Dear book coach, whenever I sit down, my inner critic won't leave me alone. Whatever I write isn't good enough. The words on the page never sound like the ones in my head. My writing group says I'm doing great, but I can't stand anything I write. How do I get rid of my inner critic? What do you think, Carrie?
First of all, Lisa, you are not alone. I think just about any writer who is working seriously, thinking seriously about writing, feels this from one time or another. I like to say everyone but a sociopath has an inner critic. And the first thing I guess I would say is, can you sit with it a little bit? Can you hear or hold the thought, then just recognize that it's just a thought, like any other thought. I know this is something that I practice and work on all the time. Those words of advice that I just passed on are advice that I've gotten from people a lot smarter than myself. And it's a really, really hard thing to do. But I feel like that is one of the only ways that you can kind of capture it a little bit and give it the weight that it deserves, which means that it's not the all-encompassing thing. And then another thing that might just practically help is to try free writing about something other than your work in progress. Go outside if you can and try to engage all of your senses and just write down what you're seeing, smelling, hearing, all of those things. Grab onto something that you've been curious about for a while, or something that you thought was funny or interesting. Describe something that happened in your day, or write a little profile of a character or someone you know in your life, something that doesn't feel like it's so hard to grasp onto, and something that it doesn't feel like it has that weight that maybe your work in progress does. Something that can get you out of your own head a little bit, since that's really, at least for me, where I find that that inner critic is just, hammering away, saying that it's not good enough, it's not good enough. Really, the thing is to just kind of get out of that headspace and try to make it fun and enjoyable again, so that you can take a certain amount of pleasure in just having the words on the page and feel the accomplishment from that. And just, again, know that you're not alone. And I think if you have a writing group, a critique partner, anybody like that, talk to them about it. I mean, if you guys haven't already talked about it, you probably have. Certainly, unless they are a sociopath, they are feeling the same way that you are. So don't be afraid to vocalize it and talk to other people about it. And just realize that we're all feeling the same thing. Yeah. Stephanie, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Carrie, because I think sometimes we think something's wrong with us if we're experiencing those thoughts and feelings, and like, oh, I must not be a real writer. Real writers don't have this kind of fear, but the truth is that everybody does. And so no matter how well published or prolific the writer, that those thoughts and feelings are so normal. So thanks for saying that. My recommendation is to remember that those thoughts of not being good enough, or the work not being good enough, or whatever the thoughts are literally just thoughts that your brain is generating as a stress response, because writing is hard. It's hard work. It's creative work. You're thinking about putting it out into the world, and that's stressful. And your brain's stress response is to come up with these thoughts. They don't mean that they're true. That doesn't mean that they're true. Just because you're having those thoughts, doesn't mean that they're real or that they're true. And it is okay to notice those thoughts and just let them go. It's a very meditative way of looking at it, but I really like to think of those thoughts as like floating by on clouds, like, oh, there goes that thought that I'm not good enough, or there goes that thought that this is a dumb idea, and just letting them float by. And then I would, consider practicing some thoughts that are better, like writing is hard, but I can do hard things. That's kind of a cliche at this point, but you get the idea. It's just replacing those painful, unhelpful thoughts with thoughts that are a little more useful. And I'm not suggesting Pollyanna thinking like I'm the best writer in the whole world, because you're not going to believe that. But if you can find realistic thoughts that are a little more positive and useful, that will be helpful. One strategy that I really like is to do what I call a brain dump before I sit down to work, where I write down all of the negative thoughts that I'm having, just as a list. Like, I'm not a good enough writer. Who do I think I am? This story idea is stupid. And I just write them down. I get them out of my head and onto a piece of paper that I can happily wad up and throw away later. You could even try writing down counter arguments for each of them. Like, this story isn't good enough. It is good enough, or something like that. And then throw that paper away. You don't need to keep it. It doesn't need to be in a fancy journal. That's not going to help you. One last thing I wanted to share for anybody who hasn't read Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic, on creativity. She has a metaphor about the inner critic. She calls it fear in her book, but she says, okay, fear, listen. I'm going to be driving the car and creativity is going to be in the passenger seat. You can come, but you have to sit in the back. You don't get to tell us where we're going. You can't touch the radio, and just sort of acknowledging that it's part of the human experience to have those feelings, and that's okay, but it doesn't need to take control. So that's what I think about it. How about you, Terry?
I love all those suggestions. They're all they're all great. I have one practical suggestion, which is I got very used to using a Pomodoro style timer when I was doing a lot of writing and had a lot of deadlines. And so I'm pretty trained that I can do anything for 25 minutes. And I found a new app called Forest, which I really love because it's really pretty. And every time you can schedule what your time frame is. If it's 20 minutes, 25 minutes, an hour, it doesn't matter. It has a nice little timer that you can watch going down. It has a nice kind of gentle music behind it. Not music, forest sounds. And you plant a tree every time you accomplish one of your things. And eventually they will plant a real tree somewhere in the forest. It is a couple of dollars, that app, but it's really fun. But I'm not usually the one for the practical solutions. So I would like to do a little exercise with us to ground down into this inner critic. In focusing, we would say an inner critic is just, it's not permanent. I think what happens to us writers, words like writer's block and inner critic get very concretized, and we think that they are something that every writer goes through, that we have to go through it. But I would rather we treat it just as, like Elizabeth Gilbert said, just as a fear, acknowledging it. The brain dump is a great idea. So let's just take a minute and see if you can find your seat, find a little support underneath you, and bring that inner critic to mind. You're here in a safe space with us. You can listen to everything that inner critic has to say. Put a little hand on if it hits some part of your, if it's in your belly, wherever it is, you can put a little hand on it. Just let it know you hear it, acknowledge it, and say, yes, I hear you. And you can ask it if it's worried about something. If it's probably worried that you are not good enough writer, or you don't have the stamina to sit there for 3 hours and write. It might have some worry, and you could check with it and perhaps an image or an idea will come to mind. And you can just kind of thank that inner critic, and sort of like Stephanie with her brain dump, just put it to the side, just saying hello to it, acknowledging it, let it know you're here, you hear its voice, but you know, you've got this work to do, and you're going to do it. And so just find a spot somewhere in your body, maybe somewhere off to the side where the inner critic can reside, and not drive you quite so crazy. You might have to do it every time you sit down, but just remember that the inner critic is not one monolithic thing. It's just, it could be a series of insecurities and worries and woes that some part of you is bringing up. But by acknowledging it, letting it know you respect its opinion, but you've still got work to do, you should be able to get past it. So that's all from me.
Thanks, Terry. I love those grounding exercises. I feel like I'm always so lucky to get a little piece of them when you share them with us. And I always feel a little bit lighter after I sit there with it a little bit. So that's great. And that's it for today. So we hope you found an answer that made sense to you at this point in your life and at this point in your book. Remember that you can submit your question at any time at dearbookcoach.com, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye, everybody.